That's the way Mama said it started. Yeah. Simple survey of the Old Testament. I forgot to change this. It's lesson 24. The United Kingdom. I forgot to change that. This is lesson 4. David, we're studying the second king of Israel. In chapter 26:10, we talked about this last week, David's confidence in divine providence. In chapter 26 and verse 10, he said, "And David said, as the Lord lives, as far as the death of Saul is concerned, it's up to the Lord. The Lord will strike him if he wants to, or his day will come to die, as everybody's day eventually comes, or he will go down into battle and perish." They're wanting David to murder Saul. He didn't want to, and David thought within himself, if it was the will of God that Saul would die, then God would see to it that Saul died. That's a way of thinking that we have to develop ourselves. Sometimes we're prone to take matters into our own hands, and we're not supposed to. We're supposed to leave it up to the Lord. Divine providence. God can take care of these things. The Apostle Paul said, "Never avenge yourselves," as David was thinking about doing, "but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." Whenever we are troubled, the thing for us to do is to keep on doing well and leave the troubler to the Lord. He's not going to let that go by. If somebody bothers you, the Lord's going to know what they did to you. If they talk about you, they're going to suffer the consequences for their sin. There's a wage to sin. There's always a wage to sin. There's a consequence to it. And whenever we're bothered, rather than trying to retaliate, instead just be good and keep on going about our business and leave the rest to God. The Lord can, through providence, He can punish a person in so many ways. It's not even funny. I mean, He can make them sick. He can cause them all kinds of grief. Working through providence, God can cause some of the worst of things to happen that we'll never even know happened. We'll just say, coincidence, odd, strange. But the Lord is always engaged in the lives of His people. And this is what Paul understood, or Paul and David. The Lord will, if He chooses to, take care of matters on His own timetable. And that's what He did with Saul. He anointed David the king of Israel, but He permitted Saul to sit on the throne for a certain amount of time. He had His reasons for doing that. But when the time came, when it was time for David to take the throne, Saul died, and David stepped in. The Lord told him to go to Hebron and take his throne, and he did. But it has to be on God's timetable. For whatever reason, He's got all kinds of things going on we know nothing about. We're talking about providence. He's working out His own plans. They are very complex. We've studied through several. I think we had a class on providence one time in the other building. And all we did was look at some of the examples of providence in the Scriptures, and it's absolutely amazing how complex the dealings of God is with people. One of the problems so many Christians suffer from today is, even though we profess belief, we have a real hard time believing that God is actually involved in our lives. We can't see Him, and we chalk things up to good fortune, coincidence, or whatever. A lot of things happen in our lives that God had nothing to do with. But there's a lot of things that happen in our lives that God did have something to do with. But we don't know it, not with certainty. The only way we can know for sure is if God told us. But one of the reasons these things are recorded for us is to teach us how God cares for his people. That's the point. God never changes. He's always the same. What he did with David, he'll do with you. There's no difference. The reason we have this example, the only reason we have this example, is to show us how God cares for his people, how he takes care of things in his own time. But you got to believe in God. That's why the Hebrew writer says in chapter 11 and verse 6, without faith it is impossible to please God. He's not saying that if you don't have faith, God isn't going to be happy. If you're a Muslim and you cannot believe in the God of heaven, God isn't going to be happy. What he's saying is, if you don't have faith, if you don't grow in faith as you should, it's impossible for you to please God. Why? Because you don't have enough incentive to do what the Lord wants you to do. You don't have enough motivation to do what the Lord wants you to do. Faith is something that we have to grow, we have to develop, we have to nurture it in our own individual lives. And the Lord makes an allowance for that curve. We're always going up in our faith. But if we're not growing as we ought to grow, we're going to get to a point where we're not doing what we ought to do because we don't have enough faith. Therefore, it's impossible to please God. Just because I believe that God is, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that's not what the Hebrews author is talking about. As a matter of fact, he gives us two reasons. He says, number one, we have to believe that God is. Okay, big deal. Anybody can believe that God exists. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. But number two, that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. That he is, and he is with us. That's the hard part to believe. David believed it. Now, his men obviously did not. They wanted to take matters into their own hands. But David knew better. He knew that God could take care of Saul whenever he chose to do so. And he left the matter alone. Yeah, Bert.
One of the things that I have a problem with, if someone, let's just say someone's lucky to do a lot of things, I want God to take care of right then. But if I'm bothering somebody else, I want it to be right. That's the hard thing we have to wrap our minds around.
Well, then that's why, we have the parables, for example. I want patience, but I don't want the Lord to dole out patience with you. We're taught about forgiveness. Well, we can apply the same principle to patience. God, be patient with me, but don't be patient with him. I want my pound of flesh today. Okay? Well, we can't be that way. We have to, from the heart, be able to accept the fact that God is in control. This is his world. I mean, he is in control. And that he can do things the best way he shall. And as for my part, forget that stuff and just tend to my business like I'm supposed to. Without faith, it is impossible to do that because we just don't have enough reason to do it. We can't trust it. God, I know you'll take vengeance, but I think I can do a better job. I can remember wrestling with that myself. But, of course, that's not true. I've learned that over the years. Very hard lesson to learn, but it's a very important lesson. Very, very important. David didn't trust Saul. Saul said he would be good. David didn't believe him. He never had before. So David said in his heart, now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand. He would go into the midst of the enemies of Israel. They'll never look for him in Philistia. And that's where he chose to go. He lived among the Philistines for, I believe it was 1 year and 4 months. He talked to Achish, who was the king of Gath, who of course knew about David. David was the great commander of the army of Israel. They all knew the name of David. He had slain thousands. And of course, the king was more than happy to accept this man on his side. When he was on the side of Israel, look at all the damage he inflicted on the Philistines. He wants to jump ship and come on his side. Well, he's tickled to death to have him on his side. So he lives there for a year and 4 months. But what happened is that David secretly carried on his war with the Philistines while feigning to be attacking the Israelite villages. David, of course, was devout to God and devout to Israel. The king thought he was attacking the Philistia cities, but in reality he was attacking not Philistia, the Israelite cities, but in reality he was talking the cities of the Philistines. Of course, he had to kill everybody, so there would be no witnesses, and that's what he did. Nobody could testify that David had done it. So the king thinks that David's working with him. The fact of the matter is David's working against him. And it's a really interesting study. If you want to study that, I would certainly encourage it. Next, we move on to Saul and the medium at Endor. First time I ever read this, I remember still, I got tickled. It was years ago. Saul knew in his mind he was not going to be able to beat the Philistines. He was greatly outnumbered. His army was just too small. So he goes to a witch, one of these people that reads crystal balls or something, and he wants to know what the future is. He goes to the witch at Endor. And the woman said to Saul, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" He needs advice. Well, he's not looking for her advice. He wants her to bring somebody back from the dead. "Who do you want me to bring up for you?" And he says, "Samuel." Of course, Samuel's dead now. "Bring Samuel back up. I got to ask him something." Well, the woman asked for Samuel to come up, and he did. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. I could just imagine that. This woman made her living deceiving people, making people think that their dead, departed spirits were coming back and speaking to them. But she knew it wasn't true because she had some kind of a con going on that she was orchestrating herself. Well, in this situation, she likely had a con ready for Saul. But when she called for Samuel to come up, he actually did come back. Of course, it wasn't her doing. God sent him up to speak to Saul, to give him a message. But I've always thought I'd like to have seen the look on her face when Samuel came back up. That had to scare her to death because no such thing had ever happened before. Well, that's a good story, but we'll move on. David's wives are captured, and he battles the Amalekites in chapter 30. And while he is doing that, Saul is busy in chapter 31 fighting the Philistines. And in that particular battle, Saul dies. He winds up committing suicide because his fate was set in stone. And he died there. This, of course, as we know, as David knew, was an act of divine providence. They took Saul and Saul and Jonathan, and I think the other sons of Saul, and they took them to Bashan, and they hung them up on a hill overlooking the city of Bashan. I was there earlier this year, and I could see where the city was. You look up on the hill, there's a building of some sort, I guess a temple that stood up there. And up there is where they hung the heads of Saul, Jonathan, and his other sons. And the people of Israel, they could look up there and they could see the Israelite kings, the king, hanging up there. Just a tidbit. For me, it was really weird to be standing there looking at it. But it was, I'd like to go back sometime. David's anointed king. Saul's dead. Got to have a king. He's anointed king by the men of Judah, and he reigns over Judah only. Of course, David's from the tribe of Judah. There's two main tribes in Israel. One of them is Judah, and the other one is Ephraim. They're the two largest tribes in the nation. There was a spitting contest between these two tribes as to which one was the greater. Ephraim thought they were the greater. They were descendants of the oldest son of Joseph, who was the savior of Israel, and they thought that they ought to be the primary tribe. Judah, of course, had the promise from God that they were going to be the primary tribe. So these two tribes, they never really got along with each other, didn't like each other, and never got along with each other very much. The other tribes in the northern part of Israel, they leaned in support of Ephraim because they're right there in their neighborhood. Judah's way off down there up in the mountains. It's isolated, Jerusalem is rather, and because Ephraim is so close, they intermingle, they do business with each other and all these things. They're partial to Ephraim. So there's a contest between these two tribes as to which one is the greater. Saul, of course, he came out of the northern portion, or not Saul, but Jeroboam came out of the northern portion, and the people decided to throw their support to him ultimately. But what happened was David is coronated king. There's actually two kingdoms now. Briefly, just for 7.5 years. He's reigning over Judah only. And Ishbosheth, who is the last surviving son of Saul, he is made king and he reigns over the northern kingdom, Israel. But he only reigned for 2 years. Other than that, they were reigned by regents in his place. I don't know if I've got this or not. Okay, war between the tribes. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. David grew stronger and stronger. The house of Saul became weaker and weaker. The northern tribes, they weren't dividing. Basically, what they were fussing over is who should be in charge. Ephraim thought they should. Judah thought they should. So they're fighting with each other. Now, you and I both know that God has chosen Judah to be the tribe of the kings of Israel. Well, they're fighting because one wants to usurp power over the other, and as they battle one another, and they're also battling outside forces, the Egyptians, they're in there, they're trying to get them to fight each other, because if they do beat each other down good enough, the Egyptians can come up and take control. I mean, there's all kinds of agitation going on at this time. But what happens is, Israel, because they are not the chosen tribe, the northern kingdom rather is not the chosen tribe, they become weaker and weaker. The southern tribe becomes stronger and stronger, which points to the fact that ultimately the southern tribe is going to come out on top, which is what happened. After 7.5 years, the men of Israel decided they would be much better off under the leadership of David than they were the way things were going. So they decided that they would make David king over the entire nation. And that's what happens in 2 Samuel chapter 5. He goes up to Ephraim. The people come there, and he's anointed the king over the entire nation. So David is actually anointed king 3 times. Once by Samuel, he was made king by God back when he was living with his daddy Jesse. The second time he was made king was by men, people, that is the people of Judah. The third time he's made king now is in 2 Samuel chapter 5, and that's over the entire 12 tribes. But in the scriptures, what you'll read is that David reigned 40 years. 33 years over 12 tribes, 7 years over 2 tribes, and it's calculated as 40 years. He didn't reign prior to being coronated king over Judah. He was king, but he didn't reign, so that's not even counted in the numbers. I was trying to make a chart, and that's the kind of stuff you got to figure out when you go in to make those charts. Things get really fuzzy. David battles the Philistines, and of course he's victorious. Things are as they ought to be, and God is supporting the nation of Israel. She's becoming larger. They're taking more and more territory away from the surrounding neighbors. They're plundering their wealth. They're becoming extremely wealthy in Judah. They did that under the reign of Saul. They're also doing that under the reign of David, or during the reign of David. They're becoming very, very wealthy and prosperous. David decides that he wants to bring the ark to Jerusalem. That's the city of David. It's where the temple will ultimately be constructed. And David feels like they ought to take the ark of God and bring it to Jerusalem. He gathered chosen men of Israel, 30,000 in all. David arose. He went with all the people who were with him from Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God. It should be in the city of David. But what we discover is the reason that the ark is there is, you remember Eli. Back when they were fighting the Philistines, and the children of Israel wanted to have a king, Eli, his sons took the ark of God into battle with the Philistines. They lost the battle. The battle went to the Philistines, and as long as the Philistines had the ark of God, they had nothing but trouble. I think they had it for 7 months. They put it in one town, and there was a plague that broke out in that town. People got large boils. Men got large boils in their private parts. And a lot of people, thousands of people actually, died because of the plague. And they said, it's the ark of God of Israel. We don't want that thing in our town. So they removed it from that town to another town. The same thing happened in the second town. And they said, we don't want this thing in our town. We're all going to die if it doesn't get out of here. So they decide that they're going to send the thing back to Israel. And they did. They made an ark. They had 2 oxen pulling the ark. They put the ark of the Lord on top of the cart, and they let the thing go back to Israel. And it's been in Abinadab's house for a period of 20 years. Now think about that. I want you to think about it. We're talking about the ark of God, one of the most important pieces of furniture the Israelites had. It's been off on its own, more or less, for 20 years. Now, why is that? Well, it appears to me that the problem is they don't have much respect for this piece of furniture, and they should, because the Ark of the Covenant of God sat in the most holy place, and this was where the Lord Jehovah was on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest would go in to offer up sacrifice for the sins of the people. One of the most important pieces of furniture in the tabernacle, and they have very little regard for it, very little respect for it, very little reverence for it. Okay? This is the mindset of the Israelites. Oh yeah, the ark, it's down at the house of Abinadab, down somewhere. Nobody really cared. Well, all of a sudden, David decides, I want to bring that ark to Jerusalem. It ought to be right here where I am, where the temple is going to be one day, where the tabernacle is. And he got these people together. They went down there to retrieve the ark and to bring it back to Jerusalem. Well, they carried the ark of God on a new cart. They brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Uzzah and, Ohio, the sons of Abinadab were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ohio went before the ark. They built a cart to haul the ark. They put the ark on it. You got a couple oxen out in front of it. One man, he's out in front, one of the priests, he's out in front. He's leading the oxen. The other man, Uzzah, he's walking alongside of the cart in case the thing was to tip. He could, steady it and keep it from falling. David and all the house of Israel were making merry before the Lord with songs, lyres, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. Okay, he did what he wasn't supposed to do. He wasn't supposed to touch the ark. He thought it was going to fall, so he put his hand up there and grabbed hold of it. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him dead there because of his error. And he died right there beside the ark of God. You weren't supposed to touch the ark. He thought it was going to fall. He touched it. He grabbed it. I can see somebody just, if you think it's going to fall, you naturally reach out to grab it. Well, this is what Uzzah did, and because he did, God became very angry, and the man died right there on the spot. David was angry because the Lord had burst forth against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. I don't know that David was angry with the Lord. The text actually said David was angry because the Lord had burst forth against Uzzah. Doesn't necessarily say he was angry with the Lord, but he was angry because the Lord killed Uzzah. Well, what was he angry with? He could have been angry with the Lord. He could have been angry with himself for orchestrating this affair in the first place. He could have been angry because Uzzah, maybe without thinking, reached up, touched the ark, and died because of it. He was angry about something. But the scripture doesn't necessarily specify that he was angry at God. There are other passages that leave us with the impression that he wasn't really angry with God, but that he was angry with himself. But we won't go into all that. In 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verses 11 through 15, this is one passage where David thinks back to the time when they moved the ark. And at that time, he did it the right way. He did it the way God said to do it. And we find out that there were 3 mistakes that were made. Number one, only Levites were allowed to move the ark. Well, they had the Levites. The right people were moving the ark, so that wasn't a problem. Number 2, they were to carry it with poles. You remember they put the ark on a cart. That's not the way you were supposed to carry the ark. The ark was kind of like a casket, and it had rings down the side. And they would put a long pole through those rings, and then the priest would grab those poles, set it up on their shoulder. And this is how they were supposed to carry the ark. When David went down to Israel, instead of following the divine pattern, he just had them build a cart and stick the ark up on the cart. So that was wrong. And number 3, you're not supposed to touch it. In Numbers chapter 4 and 15, God clearly said that if a priest touches the ark of God, then he will immediately die. That was a rule that God gave all the way back to the time of Moses. The Lord was angry. And I think what he was angry about was the irreverence and the lack of respect that was shown to the Ark of the Covenant. I think the whole situation was what he was angry with. They didn't care. They didn't respect it. They didn't respect his wishes. David, on a whim, wanted it in Jerusalem because that's where he was. But he did not follow the divine prescription for moving the ark. Well, in 1 Chronicles chapter 15, David wants to move it to Jerusalem again. This time, he does it the right way. Only the priest will carry it. They'll carry it using poles on their shoulders. So the second time that David attempted to move the ark, he did it the way Moses prescribed. I think part of the reason for Uzzah's death may have been, well, number one, it's because that was the law. And number two, I think it was because there was a lack of respect and reverence for this very precious article that belonged to the tabernacle. But you know something else it demonstrates to us? How were the Israelites observing the Passover if they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant? They weren't. That's another thing. They were supposed to be observing the Passover, one of the highest, the holiest feasts that existed among the Israelites, but they weren't even observing that. As a matter of fact, what we'll discover is that eventually there's going to be a king in Judah. His name is Josiah, who is going to come to the throne in the 7th century BC. I think it's about 50 years before the fall of Jerusalem. And the scripture says this is the first time the Passover was observed since the time of the judges of Israel. You got to go all the way back to the judges. That was the last time Israel had ever observed the Passover. For most of their history, they didn't even do it. There was a lack of respect on the part of the Israelites for these things. And I think the outbreak against Uzzah, in part, was due to show the Lord's great disdain for the attitude that existed among his people. Irreverence towards holy things. Irreverence towards holy times. For example, when we come together to meet with God. We come to meet with the God of heaven. But so many times, are we truly reverent in the presence of the Almighty God? Is our reverence, can it be seen? Do we demonstrate respect when we come in the presence of the Almighty? That's something to think about seriously. I think that's what I think that was the real thing that the Lord was angry with, was just the whole attitude that existed among his people. They were irreverent towards things that they should have revered very much, but they did not. And he didn't care for that. It's possible that we may show more reverence towards occasions of people than we show towards occasions where we come into the presence with the living God. And that's something I think we ought to think about very carefully. How we dress, our demeanor, all these things ought to be scrutinized. Is this the way I want to appear before God on this particular day? Just think about it. It's just a thought. I think the kids are coming back.